The year is 2012, April 12th, a Tuesday. The room is beige. The air smells of stale coffee and paper. This is the Sacramento hearing room for the State Water Resources Control Board. A young hydrologist stands at a podium. His name is David Chen. He is nervous. He clicks to the final slide of his presentation. It is a satellite map of the San Joaquin Valley, a patchwork of browns and faded greens, except for one spot, a deep, impossible emerald, a perfect rectangle of life in a landscape of thirst. The chairman of the board, a man named Arthur Grady, leans forward. He adjusts his glasses. He has seen 1,000 maps like this, but never one with a shape so defiant. He asks the young man to repeat the name of the water district. David Chen clears his throat. He says it's not a district, sir. It's a cooperative. The Vance Cooperative. The chairman goes still. His hands, which had been shuffling papers, stop moving. The name is familiar. He had a different file on that valley. A file from 30 years ago. A file from a company called Aquacor. A file that said the valley was fallow, that its water rights were consolidated, that its future was managed. He looks at the green rectangle on the screen, a green that shouldn't exist, a green that defied every projection, every model, every certainty. He remembers the man from Aquacor, a good man named Frank Harris. Frank had stood in a room just like this one. He had presented his own map. He had shown the board how they would save that valley from itself. He had been so sure. Everyone had been so sure. The chairman looks back at the young hydrologist. He asks a simple question. Who is Vance? This is the story of that green rectangle. This is the story of a promise kept to the dirt and a lesson taught to the sky. We tell stories like this one. Stories about the people who were counted out, the ones who were told they couldn't, the ones who were offered protection they never asked for. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe in the quiet power of proving people wrong over decades, then subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in that valley changed everything, and we are going to tell you all of it. Let's go back. The year is 1982. The valley is not yet famous. It is just a place. Dry hills holding a flat pan of fertile soil. A place where families had farmed for 100 years. They were good people. They worked hard. They trusted each other. And they were running out of water. The wells were getting deeper. The pumps were running longer. The costs were going up. Then came the man from Aquacorp. His name was Frank Harris. Frank was not a villain. It is important you understand this. He was a deacon at his church. He coached Little League. He grew up in a town just like this one. He believed with his entire heart in what he was doing. He saw families struggling. He saw farms on the edge of failure. He saw a problem that he and his company could solve. He went door to door. He sat at kitchen tables. He drank coffee with men whose hands were cracked from work and worry. He made them an offer, a good offer, cash for their water rights, a generous price, more money than some of them had seen in their lives, and a leaseback agreement. They could keep farming their land. They would just buy the water from Aquacor. The water would be reliable, managed by experts, delivered by a modern, efficient system. No more worrying about a dry well. No more sleepless nights. He was offering them certainty. He was offering them peace of mind. He was offering them protection. One by one they signed. The Schmidts, the Garcias, the Taylors. Families who had been there since the beginning. They took the cash. They felt the relief. They trusted Frank. Why wouldn't they? He was one of them. He understood. By the spring of 1982, he had every signature, every single water right in the valley, or so he thought. There was one last farm, the old Vance place, 80 acres at the far end of the valley. It belonged to a young woman, Elara Vance. Her grandfather had died the year before. He left her the land. He left her the small house. He left her the old windmill turning slowly in the breeze. Frank Harris drove his Ford sedan down the long dirt driveway. He saw her out by the barn, mending a fence. She was young, maybe 25. She had her grandfather's eyes, clear and steady. He walked up to her, hat in his hands. He introduced himself. He spoke to her with respect. He told her what the company was doing. He explained the benefits, the security, the community joining together in this new system. He presented her with the same offer, a check for $200,000, a life-changing amount of money in 1982. Elara listened. She did not interrupt him. She just watched his face as he spoke. He spoke with such sincerity, such genuine concern. She could feel it. He truly believed he was helping her. When he finished, she asked a question. "And my well?" Frank smiled a kind, patient smile. "The company will cap it," he said, "for safety. Then we'll run a new pipe to your property. You'll have a meter just like everyone else. You pay for what you use. It's a much better system." Elara looked past him. She looked at the old air motor windmill. Its blades were catching the afternoon sun. "My grandfather dug that well," she said. "He dug it with his own hands." Frank nodded, his expression full of sympathy. "I know," he said. "I knew your grandfather. A fine man, a hard worker. But this is the modern world, Elara. His methods were from another time. Our geologists have surveyed this entire valley. The water table is dropping. That well of yours, it's a shallow well. It's drawing from the perched aquifer. It might last another 5 years, maybe 10 if we get a lot of rain. Then it will run dry." He leaned in a little closer. His voice was soft. "I'm not going to be the man who lets you wake up one morning with a dry well and a dead farm. This offer is about protecting you from that. It's about securing your future." He sounded so reasonable, so certain. Have you ever been told you couldn't do something? Not by an enemy, not by a rival, but by someone who genuinely believed they were protecting you. Someone whose certainty about your limits felt like a cage built from kindness. It is the most dangerous limitation of all, because you cannot fight it with anger. You cannot argue against its logic. It can only be disproven, and that takes decades. If you know that feeling, drop a comment below. Tell us about the person who was certain on your behalf. Because what Elara did next was not a protest. It was not a fight. It was a quiet, simple act of refusal. She looked at Frank Harris, at his kind eyes, his worried expression. She looked at the check in his hand, and she said 2 words. "No, thank you." Frank was stunned. He couldn't comprehend it. He tried to explain again, the geology, the numbers, the risk. She just shook her head. "My grandfather left me the land," she said. "He didn't say anything about the water." Frank's professional patience began to fray, a flicker of frustration. "Elara, the water rights are tied to the land deed. We've checked the county records for every parcel." She walked back toward the house. She motioned for him to follow. Inside, the house was simple, clean. It smelled of wood polish and lavender. She went to an old roll-top desk, her grandfather's desk. She pulled out a long, narrow box made of tin. She opened it. Inside was a deed. Not the modern kind printed from a county computer. This was on thick, yellowed paper. The writing was calligraphy. The date on it was 1888. It was the original patent deed, signed by the state land office. It granted the land to her great-great-grandfather, and it had a clause. a clause written in the elegant, looping script of the 19th century. It granted him the land, the timber, the mineral rights, and, it said, all rights to the waters riparian, percolating, and subterranean, from the surface to the center of the earth, in perpetuity. Frank Harris read it. He read it twice. He let out a small, tired sigh. He had seen things like this before. Old, archaic language from a time before water law was codified. "Elara," he said, his voice gentle again, "this is a historical document. It's beautiful, but it's not legally binding in the modern sense. The courts have clarified these things over the years. Subterranean water is governed by state regulations now. This clause, it wouldn't hold up." She didn't argue. She just pointed to a different part of the document, a stamp from the county recorder, dated 1923. Her grandfather, a man who trusted old ways but understood new ones, had taken this original deed to the county courthouse the year the state passed its first major water act. He had it formally recorded and adjudicated. A judge's signature was pressed into the paper. His right was grandfathered in, permanent, unseverable from the land. It was not in the digital system AquaCorp had searched. It was in a leather-bound ledger in the county archives. Ledger 12, page 347, a detail they had missed. Frank felt a cold knot in his stomach. This was a problem, a complication. But he was a man who solved problems. He looked at her. He made a new offer. $400,000. He said the company would make an exception. She closed the tin box. The click was soft, but final. "The answer is no, Mr. Harris." He stood there for a long moment. He was a good man. He truly believed he was saving this valley. And he truly believed this young woman was making a catastrophic mistake. He looked at her with a profound, almost paternal pity. "All right, Elara," he said. "I can't force you. But when that well runs dry, and it will, please, don't be too proud to call me. We'll still be here." He left. He drove back down the long dirt driveway. He saw the windmill in his rearview mirror, turning and turning. He felt a sadness for her, a deep and certain sadness for the future he knew she would face. That night, Elara sat at the kitchen table. The tin box was open in front of her. She felt the weight of that conversation, the weight of his certainty. Doubt is a seed. His kindness had planted it deep. Was he right? Was she being foolish? Sentimental? She opened another drawer in the desk. She pulled out a stack of journals, her grandfather's journals, bound in worn leather, filled with his handwriting. Notes on the weather, crop rotations, prices at the market, and notes on water. Page after page about water. He had been a dowser, a water witch, a man who believed the earth spoke a language you could learn. He had walked this land for 60 years. He had mapped its secrets. In the back of the final journal she found a map. It was drawn by hand, a map of their 80 acres. But on it were lines and symbols she didn't recognize. There was a circle where the house and the windmill stood. A note next to it said, "Shallow well, 90 feet. Good for the house, not for the fields." Then, a few hundred yards away, another circle, a bigger one, and a line drawn down from it into the cross-section of the earth he had sketched below. The line went deep, past the layer he labeled perched aquifer, past a thick layer of clay he called the hard pan, down into a layer labeled the old river, an ancient underground aquifer, slow-moving, ice-cold, fed by snowmelt from mountains 100 miles away. A note was written beside it. The deep water, 450 feet, Never runs dry. Too deep for my pump. And below that, one sentence. A sentence she had heard him say 1,000 times. The deep water remembers its own. Ilara closed the book. The doubt planted by Frank Harris withered. His certainty was based on science, on geology, on modern instruments. Her grandfather's certainty was based on something else, on listening, on patience, on a lifetime of walking the same patch of dirt. She had a choice. Trust the man with the checkbook and the satellite maps, or trust the man who drew his maps by hand. She went to bed. The next morning she got to work. Let me tell you about the next few years. They were not easy. The neighbors watched her. At the town cafe they talked. She's a fool, they said, sitting on a gold mine and she won't sell. Her grandfather was a good man, but he was stubborn. She's got his stubborn streak. Frank Harris tried to do right by her. She'll be begging for water in 5 years. The community split. Most of them treated her with a kind of polite distance, the same pity she had seen in Frank's eyes. A few old-timers, men who had known her grandfather, would stop by. They wouldn't say much. One of them, a man named George Schmidt, dropped off a set of old pipe wrenches. "Your grandpa lent these to me in '68, he said. "Figured you might have a use for them." He didn't mention the water. He didn't need to. Ilara knew her first problem. Her grandfather was right. The shallow well was enough for the house, but it wasn't enough for 80 acres of crops. The deep water was the future. But a modern deep well pump cost $50,000, money she did not have. She couldn't drill a new well, but her grandfather's map showed something else. He hadn't just located the deep water. He had drilled a test bore. A narrow 4-inch pipe, capped and hidden under a flat stone behind the barn. He had reached the water. He just couldn't bring it up. She had the well. She needed a pump. So she built one. From scraps. From ingenuity. From her grandfather's notes. She bought a used cylinder from a salvage yard. She found old stock leather cups for the piston. She spent a month rebuilding the gearbox of the air motor windmill, changing the gear ratios to give it more lift, more torque. Less speed, more power. She ran hundreds of feet of sucker rod down that 4-inch pipe. It was slow, back-breaking work. George Schmidt would sometimes show up. He'd hold a wrench. He'd steady a pipe. He'd share a glass of iced tea. He never offered advice unless she asked. He just offered his presence. A quiet vote of confidence. By the fall of 1983, it was done. The windmill wasn't just pumping from the shallow well anymore. It was drawing from 450 feet down. The water that came out was different, colder, purer. It felt ancient. The flow was not a torrent. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse. 1 gallon for every turn of the blades. A slow, patient heartbeat. It wasn't enough for flood irrigation. It wasn't enough for the wasteful sprayers her neighbors used with Aquacorp's pressurized water. So she changed the way she farmed. She read books on desert agriculture. She learned about drip irrigation, a new technique from Israel. She couldn't afford the commercial systems, so she built her own. She bought thousands of feet of cheap black polypipe. She used the windmill to pump the deep water into a large holding tank she bought at an auction. A simple concrete tank on a platform her grandfather had built. From there, gravity did the work. Slowly feeding water through the thin pipes, dripping it directly onto the roots of her plants. No waste, no evaporation. Every drop counted. Her neighbors watched her lay the strange black tubing. They shook their heads. "That's not how you farm," they said. "You can't grow anything like that." She didn't plant the thirsty crops they grew, the cotton, the alfalfa. She planted things her grandfather had written about in his journals. Drought-resistant heirloom tomatoes, tepary beans, melons that grew in the desert, crops that remembered what it was like to be thirsty. Her yields were smaller, she knew they would be, but her costs were almost nothing. Her water was free, her electricity was the wind, her fertilizer was compost from her own barn. Meanwhile, her neighbors were paying. Aquacorp's water rates went up 3% that year, and the next, and the next. Frank Harris would drive through the valley sometimes. He'd see her out in the fields. He'd see her small, strange-looking operation. He'd see the windmill turning, and he'd shake his head, still feeling that same deep, certain pity. She's barely getting by, he'd think. It's only a matter of time. Because this is where the story becomes about more than one farm. This is where it becomes about the math, the quiet, brutal math of water. Aquacorp was efficient. They had big electric pumps. They drew millions of gallons from the shallow aquifer. They were mining the water, using it faster than the rain could replace it. By 1985, the water table in the valley had dropped 5 feet. Their pumps had to work a little harder. Their electricity bills went up, so their prices went up. Ilara's well, the deep well, didn't notice. It was drinking from a different cup. That year, she cleared a profit of $10,000. Cash. Not a lot of money, but it was hers. No debt, no water bill, no dependency. In 1987, the Taylors, her neighbors to the east, had a bad year. The price of cotton fell. The price of water went up. They couldn't make their lease payment. Aquacorp, following the terms of the contract, did not renew their lease. The land went fallow. Ilara went to see them. She brought a casserole. She sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they had signed the papers with Frank Harris. She made them an offer. She would buy their 80 acres. She offered them a fair price for the dry land, $30,000.
They were hesitant. "What would you do with it?" Mrs. Taylor asked.
"There's no water." Ilara just nodded. "I'll manage," she said. She paid them in cash. She didn't have a pump powerful enough to get water over to their land. So she found another windmill at a scrapyard. She spent the winter rebuilding it. She laid more black polypipe. Slowly, patiently, she brought the Taylor place back to life. The expansion had begun. It happened like a drumbeat. Slow, steady, rhythmic. 1990, a mild drought. The valley's water table dropped another 10 feet. Aquacorp's pumping costs rose 7%. The Garcia family sold their 100 acres to a developer who thought he could build houses. He couldn't get the water rights. He sold the land at a loss a year later. Ilara bought it. Cash. She had 260 acres, 3 windmills, a growing network of gravity-fed pipes. Her profits were $40,000 a year. 1995. The state experienced a real drought. A bad one. The shallow aquifer in the valley dropped 30 feet in 1 year. Aquacorp had to drill deeper wells. Their capital costs exploded. They petitioned the state for a 20% rate hike. The farmers who leased from them protested. It didn't matter. The contract was the contract. Many of them went bankrupt. They walked away from the land their families had owned for a century. The land reverted to Aquacorp. Land they had no way to irrigate profitably. They let it go fallow. Weeds grew in the fields. Frank Harris, now a vice president at the company, looked at the numbers. He saw the rising red ink. He drove through the valley he was supposed to have saved. He saw the fallow fields, the empty farmhouses. And then he would drive past the Vance place and her new land. It was all green. Not a vibrant, wasteful green, a deep, resilient green. The green of plants that knew how to survive. He saw 4 windmills turning. He saw her driving an old tractor. He saw a quiet, thriving enterprise. The pity he had felt for her was gone. It was replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name, a confusion, a deep, unsettling feeling that the world did not work the way he was so certain it did. He did not stop. He never spoke to her. He just watched from a distance, a quiet witness to the failure of his own certainty. By the year 2000, Alara Vance owned 1,000 acres. Cash. She had 10 windmills. They were like silent sentinels watching over the valley. She was no longer just a farmer. She was the steward of a new kind of agriculture. The Vance method, people started to call it. Low energy, low water, low cost, high resilience. Young people from the university started coming out to see her, to learn. She didn't give speeches, she didn't lecture. She just showed them. She showed them the soil, rich with organic matter, alive with worms. She showed them the windmills, the simple, elegant mechanics. She showed them the numbers in her ledger, the small, steady profits, the absence of debt. She proved it was possible, not just to survive, but to thrive, on your own terms. And then came the reckoning. The year was 2011, the beginning of the Great Drought, the one that would rewrite the history of water in the West. For 3 years, the rains failed. The snowpack in the mountains vanished. The state turned brown. The shallow aquifer in the valley, the one Aquacorp had been mining for 30 years, collapsed. It didn't just drop. It was gone. Their wells pumped sand, then air. By the spring of 2012, Aquacorp's multi-million-dollar infrastructure was useless. They were ruined. Their stock price plummeted to zero. The valley, except for one part of it, was a desert. The topsoil blew away in the wind. The farmhouses stood empty, ghosts in a sea of dust. One day in April, a shiny black car drove down the dirt road to Alara's house. A road that was now well-maintained. 2 men got out. One was a young man in a sharp suit, an executive from what was left of Aquacorp. The other was an old man. His shoulders were stooped. His face was a map of worry. It was Frank Harris. He was 75 years old, retired, brought in as a consultant, as the man who knew the history of the valley. Alara met them on the porch. She was 55 now. Her hair had streaks of gray. Her hands were still the hands of a farmer. She looked at Frank Harris. She had not spoken to him in 30 years. The young executive did the talking. He was brisk, professional. He explained their situation. He explained the company was facing liquidation. He said they had a proposal, a last-ditch effort to save their assets. He opened his briefcase. He presented her with a geologist's report, the same report the young man was presenting to the State Water Board that very week. It showed her deep water aquifer. It showed that it was untouched by the drought, a vast, stable resource. He then presented her with an offer. They wanted to buy her water. Not the rights, just the water. They would pay her $10 million, cash, for a 20-year contract. They would install their own pumps, their own pipelines. They would manage everything. She would be wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. She would never have to work another day in her life. He finished his presentation. He smiled, confident. It was an offer no one could refuse. Alara didn't look at him. She didn't look at the contract. She looked at Frank Harris. He would not meet her eyes. He was staring at the floor of the porch, at a crack in the wood. She spoke. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not triumphant. It was the voice of a woman stating a fact. 30 years ago, you stood on this spot, she said to Frank. You told me my well would run dry. You told me you were protecting me. Frank finally looked up. His eyes were wet. I thought I was, he whispered. I was so sure. Ilara paused. She let the silence hang in the dry air. She let him feel the full weight of his certainty, the full cost of the protection he had offered. Then she turned to the young executive. The answer is no. The young man was speechless. He stammered. But why? This is $10 million. Ilara looked out over her land, the green fields, the turning windmills. That money is your solution, she said. It's not mine. But what was her solution? It wasn't to get rich. It wasn't to watch her neighbors fail. It was something else entirely. She went back inside. She came back with a folder. She handed it to Frank Harris. Inside were deeds, dozens of them. She had spent the last year with a lawyer. She had subdivided her 1,000 acres back into their original family plots. The Taylor place, the Garcia place, the Schmidt place. These are for them, she said. The families, the ones who are still around. They can have their land back, no cost. Frank was confused. But the water? He asked. There's no water. The water belongs to the cooperative, she said. We're forming a cooperative. The families that live here, they will be the board. They will own the water together. My windmills will supply it. But they have to agree to the rules. No flood irrigation, no water-hungry crops. They have to farm the Vance method. They have to learn to listen to the land. They have to put more back than they take out. The young executive was aghast. You're giving it away? He said. This is the most valuable water in California. You could be a billionaire. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time a small smile touched her lips. You still don't understand, do you? She said. Some things aren't for sale. That is the story of the green rectangle. But that's not the end of the story. Because a legacy is not what you own. It's what you create for others. The Vance Cooperative was formed in 2013. The old families came back. The children and grandchildren of the people who had sold out. They learned from Ilara. They learned to farm with patience, with respect. The valley came back to life, not as a monoculture of industrial crops, but as a diverse, resilient patchwork of small, profitable farms. The Vance method became a model for arid agriculture around the world. Ilara used the profits from her own farm, which she kept, to create a foundation, the Deepwater Foundation. It funds scholarships for students in hydrology, soil science, and sustainable farming. It gives grants to young farmers who want to stay on the land. Frank Harris lived out the rest of his life in a small house in the nearby town. He saw the valley reborn. He saw the windmills turning. He saw the children of the families he had tried to protect, driving tractors and mending fences. He never spoke to Ilara again, but every Sunday at his church he prayed for her, a prayer of gratitude, for the woman who had saved the valley from his certainty. Today, if you visit the office of the Vance Cooperative, a simple, functional building, you will see something on the wall behind the main desk. It is a map, drawn by hand on old, yellowed paper. It shows the 80 acres where it all started. It shows the lines of the deep aquifer, the old river. It is her grandfather's map, framed under glass, a physical artifact of a promise kept. Sometimes, a young girl comes into the office. She is Ilara's great-granddaughter. She is 10 years old. She will stand in front of the map. She will place her small hand on the glass, right over the spot that says, the deep water. She is learning the language of the earth. She is learning to listen. The deep water remembers its own. This story is about water, but it's also about something else. It's about the gap between what the world tells you is possible and what you know to be true. It's about the quiet, lonely work of proving people wrong. Not with arguments, not with anger, but with decades of dirt under your fingernails. Right now, somewhere in the world, A good person is telling someone they can't. They are doing it with kindness, with logic, with certainty. They are offering protection, and that person has a choice: to accept the cage of someone else's limitations, or to find their own deep water, to trust the map drawn by their own hands. If this story means something to you, if it reminds you of a time you chose to trust yourself over the certainty of others, share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is standing at that same crossroads. Subscribe for more stories of the quiet rebels, the patient builders, the ones who know that the most powerful thing you can do is build a future that others were certain could not exist.